All right, Brush Monkeys, welcome back. And this week we are looking at some game changers in miniature painting. And these are like not just the stuff that is new or exciting in the industry. These are things that have made the biggest change to my own miniature painting and had the biggest influence on me. And so I wanted to talk about some of these and how they affect the evolution of my painting. Now, I started off painting back in 1978. I was about 7 years old, and back then, growing up in Topeka, Kansas, it was pre-internet, it was communities of miniature painters. There weren't a lot of other miniature painters in Topeka, so there wasn't the local game store didn't have classes on how to paint minis and all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of trial and error. I started out painting with Tester's paints and Tester's god awful huge ass brushes, trimmed down to try to get as much of the detail as I could on those old miniatures, and they looked horrible. They really did. I was really happy with how some of them came out because I didn't know any better and I was still learning, but they were pretty bad. So some of the things that helped my personal painting evolution is, first and foremost, surgical forceps like these. When I was growing up, my mom was a nurse, and so she was able to get these from work, but you can get them at pretty much any gun show nowadays, and they're just basically little needle nose pliers that lock. You got a little ratchet thing there that locks them up, and these were great when Citadel miniatures first came out. They had a little slot between the feet that you could grab onto with these things. But even with just the regular figures like the Grenadier and Raoul Parthy, you could kind of clamp onto the base and hold on to it, and that gave you something more to hold on to than just a little tiny figure and try to paint on it. So that was like my earliest painting handle. So that made a huge difference, being able to paint without actually touching the figure, because those old Tester paints and the old enamel paints really took a long time to dry. And they were basically oil-based paints and oil paints, and they took a long time to dry, and they had to be cleaned with white spirits, and it was a bad scene all the way around. And so the next thing that made a really big difference for me was acrylic paints, and paints made specifically for miniatures. This is one of the earliest Citadel miniatures that I put into a dropper bottle, but they used to come in these pots. I don't think I have any. No, I don't have any that are still in the pots. P3 still uses that same kind of pot, but I've decanted all mine into dropper bottles since then. But the earliest paints specifically for miniatures were Poly S and Floquil. Those were the first ones made specifically for models, I should say, not necessarily for miniatures. Excuse me. And those were made with much finer ground pigments and acrylic flow improvers and that kind of thing that made it easier to get into all the little details that miniatures had back then. The Armory was another early made specifically for miniatures. They were a miniature producing company, and so they made their own line of paints that were just for miniatures. And those came in these big jars that were about that big around. They were huge. And then, like I said, Citadel came out with their own line of paints that looked fantastic. I ended up buying tons of those. Let's see if usually there's like an ad in the back of one of these that shows the paints. But the Citadel paints were fantastic. That brings us around to the painting guides here. Citadel was one of the first ones that had a dedicated painting guide to painting miniatures, a complete guide to painting Citadel miniatures, and it covers everything in this. It covers getting started, useful tools, setting up your workspace, There's a picture of the old pots that the Citadel paints used to come in, and the brushes they used to have available. And this is an example of your kind of hobby space. And I've bought probably 2 or 3 full sets of the paints when they came out, because they came out in 88 or 89. I forget when this book came out. Okay, this book was published in 93. So and this was one of the early ones, so this was tells you how late in the game it was. But yeah, this was a huge game changer. It's helped me figure out a lot of things. It showed how to do the preparation, base coating, armor and weapons, shading, furs, horses, all kinds of stuff. There's just a ton of stuff in here, and it's even got advanced techniques like blending and glazing, which was a huge revelation back in the day. But I think when the paints first came out in '89, I was in the Navy, and I bought 2. I think over the course of my time in the Navy, I bought 2 sets of them, because I bought 1 set and then ended up taking that home in between duty stations. And then when I got to my next duty station, I bought another set because I wanted to paint on the ship. But the heavy metal painting guides were a big help. They came out with a bunch of different ones on terrain and Warhammer 40K and Space Marines and all kinds of stuff like that. Covered all that stuff. The other thing Citadel came out with that I thought was brilliant was the Arcane Armorials here, which were shield transfers. This was the first transfers that Citadel came out with, and they had at the time these little plastic shields that had a little inset area in them, and these shield transfers were designed to fit inside those little plastic shields. You see, they had different shapes, all kinds of different shapes depending on the shape of the shield, so you could fit stuff in there. And then they had bigger designs that you could use for banners, like this. And they had chaos designs and regular hero designs and all this kind of thing. Big, huge designs for banners. This is back when they had huge banners on the battlefield, and all the banners were like way bigger than the figures carrying them and all that kind of thing. But these were fantastic. These were the original transfers, and I still have some of these. And these were fantastic for people who didn't like doing freehand or weren't able to do freehand like me, that just functionally illiterate when it comes to freehand. But these were a huge game changer, and I love these things. And then finally, the biggest thing that made a difference in my painting was I knew how to do shade washes as far as thinning down a paint and making that into a wash. But when the Citadel Expert paint set came out, it came in these little dropper bottles like this, and these were inks. And you can see they had green ink and chestnut ink. They had red, blue, green, purple. I think it came with like 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, I think it came with 9 bottles altogether of these little things. And I used these things. I'm amazed I still have any of these things left, because I used them on. I used it like Frank's hot sauce. I put that shit on everything. These were a huge revelation, that now you could paint something and then just wash it with the green wash, like an orc. You'd paint an orc green and then wash it with this green wash, and it would come out all nice and dark green in the crevices. It was almost like the contrast paints now. It would just automatically shade it. It would tint everything else, and then you just go back over with the highlights and it looks beautiful. These things made such a huge difference. It's like overnight my miniatures got 100% better just by using the inks. So I'm a big believer in still using these inks. But all of that stuff is kind of old hat nowadays. I took a break starting in 1998. I moved up to Kansas City, and then there were a lot more stuff to learn when I got back into it. So there was a lot to learn when I got back into it. Alright, so when I got back into painting in 2013, I had taken about 15 years off. And at that time, Citadel Miniatures went from all metal to almost all plastic figures. Like, they were just starting to introduce plastic figures when I got out of it. And then when I got back into it, everything was plastic. But I was able to find a bunch of my old paints in a box, and this little gadget right here made the biggest difference, because I didn't have to start all over with brand new paints. This thing is a paint stirrer. You can see it's got this little head on the end of it there, and it's just battery powered. You can slide that off. You see it's just one AA battery, and that slides on there, and you just put that down in the paint pot and hit that button, and it mixes your paint up. And this thing enabled me to revive almost all of the old Citadel paint pots that I have and put them into dropper bottles. And so this thing saved me probably close to $600 or $700 worth of paint all by itself. This thing is I think it's about $20 from Micromark, and this is worth every dime. Speaking of dropper bottles, that was the other big revelation. It's putting everything into these little dropper bottles so that you don't waste as much paint, and you can fit a lot more of them on the shelf than you can with the little Citadel pots. These are the kind of pots that Citadel comes in now, and then these are the dropper bottles, and you can just see dropper bottles got a much smaller footprint. So you can fit a lot more of them on the shelf. These things are fantastic. You only use as much paint as you're actually working with at a time. You're not wasting as much. These things are wonderful. I highly recommend getting as many of those as you can and decanting all your paints over to them. Or just buy paints that come in dropper bottles anyway. Brands like Vallejo. Vallejo comes in dropper bottles. Army Painter, Scale 75, all the Green Stuff World, all those already come in dropper bottles. So yeah, definitely recommend getting some dropper bottles. Speaking of dropper bottles, the biggest revelation in my painting, and the biggest thing that's helped improve it, is this little gadget, the wet palette. This thing is amazing. For those of you that aren't familiar with wet palettes, essentially there's a sponge or some type of absorbent material on the bottom, and that's soaked in water, and then you get this permeable cloth. It's usually like baker's parchment or something like that, sits on top of it, and you drop your paints on there out of the dropper bottle, and it keeps them wet. And to give you an idea how well that works, these paints are all probably more than a week, 2 weeks old, and they've been sitting in here that whole time, and they're all still wet. You can see how some of them are separated, but that's not a big deal. You can take a brush and stir that up, and it's perfectly fine to work with. This thing has saved me so much money. Essentially, it's just a sealable plastic box that holds all that in there and keeps it wet and keeps it from drying out. And that has saved me so much money. So much money. This is actually I think the second one I got. The first one was a P3 wet palette, which worked but not as well. The Redgrass Games palette, that's the one that I have now, and that thing was that is it's not the Studio XL, it's the painter version, is the orange one, and that's made a huge difference. I love that thing. It's fantastic. The other big thing that's made a difference, and probably one of the first things that I got into when I started painting, was airbrushes. And I show you this because this is actually the first one I bought. This is the Citadel paint gun, and essentially the air hose connects onto here. You pull the trigger, and it siphons paint up out of this jar and blows it out the front there. And you can kind of see where the air goes. So the air creates a vacuum that pulls the paint up out of the jar and blows it out. and it's really fairly rudimentary, and it's hard to adjust the size of the paint spray. You can to a certain degree, but not real well. And but this thing is fantastic for doing undercoats, for doing priming. If you're doing like a whole army of guys, you can fill this up with primer and just spray the whole lot of them. From there, I moved up to, this thing is filthy because I use it all the time, but this is a Harbor Freight bottom feed airbrush, and I put the cup on this one, but it's essentially the same thing. You've got air comes in here and gets blown out the front. It sucks the paint out of the cup through the bottom. You've only got a one trigger, so you just push down for air and paint, and functionally it's the same thing as this. Then you can move up to double action airbrushes like this one. This is, again, a little cheap one from Harbor Freight. I'm not going to get out the really good airbrushes, but this is double action airbrush, which means, again, you got paint here, air here, and with the double action, you push down for air and then pull back the thing, and you can see that pulling back the trigger moves this needle that goes all the way through it. And that needle points out the front. I don't know if you can see that or not, but essentially when you're painting, you push down for air, back for paint. Pulling it back allows the paint to flow out there, and you can adjust how much air versus how much paint by how far you rock it back or how far down you push the button, and it's a lot more versatile. This is kind of the same principle that my really good airbrushes like the Badger and the Sotar go off of. These are all cheap examples. They will do the job. They're not fantastic. They're not good for like really fine detail. But if you're just looking to prime a bunch of models, these are amazing and so much better than doing it by hand with a regular brush. So the other thing that's made a huge difference is dedicated holders. This is a Redgrass Games holder, and it comes with these little bits here. You see they've got a little hole in the back that just snaps onto there. This little bit of putty holds the head on. If you watched my video last week, I went into talking about dedicated holders. But you've got the Redgrass Games holder, and you've got things like the Citadel holder, and both of those are better for holding onto the miniature while you're painting, and they fit better in your hand and allow you to manipulate the miniature however you need to in order to paint it without getting your fingers on it and getting skin oils on it and messing things like that. So that's a huge game changer. The next thing is, I'm gonna see if I can. Okay, I'm gonna unplug this briefly. Just gonna bring this bad boy over here. Move the airbrushes out of the way. This big monster. This is the Vortex mixer, and this thing is heavy as all get out. It's got all these little nubbins on the bottom that it rests on, but it's really heavy, and it just sits there on your workbench and it doesn't move. And I've still got the cords tied up on it, so I didn't want to undo the cords. But essentially, when you push down on it, it mixes up it's got this little thing that spins and it mixes up the paint. I'm going to go ahead and plug this back in and move the camera so you can see how this works, because it really is pretty brilliant. Just a second here. Okay. Alright, so let me move the camera here. Alright, so here's where I normally have it, and you can see how junky my desk is. But I've got this bottle here. This is just plain water in here, and it's got a little agitator in the bottom. But if you imagine this is paint, then this is how the Vortex mixer works. You just push it down on that, and you can see it creates that little tornado in the bottle. If I can zoom in a little bit more. And even when you stop, it still spins around in there a little bit. That's what mixes up your paint. And this is just an absolutely brilliant little device. They're a little bit expensive. They're actually laboratory equipment, but they are worth every dime of it, and they are fantastic. So if you get a chance, get one of those little vortex mixers. The next game changer I want to talk about, and this is really kind of just for me, or guys my age that started out way back in the day. Some of us don't have such great eyesight anymore, but Micromark sells these little clip-on magnifiers, and these look dorky as hell when you're actually wearing them, but essentially all they are is just clip them onto your glasses like that, and it enables you to see better up close details. And when you're not using them, you can just kind of flip them up out of the way like that, just like flip up sunglasses, but these are magnifiers. And I don't know that I would be the painter I am today if I didn't have these things. They come in two different strengths. There's like a 4X and a 2X. I gave the 2X to my wife to help with her sewing, and I use the 4X for my painting. I also went to Target and just picked up one of these little glasses cases, just a little sleeve for the glasses. These things are free. But they help protect the lenses, so that's fantastic. And last but not least, the biggest game changer, I think, that's not only helped me, but kind of helps everybody, and hopefully it'll help you too, is YouTube and the communities of miniature painters now. There's so many more miniature painters, and because we're all kind of connected by this World Wide Web, there's communities of miniature painters. If you're into Reaper, you can go on Facebook and there's multiple pages dedicated just to those miniatures. If you like Reaper miniatures, there's Reaper paint groups. There's the Mocan miniature painters groups for people in Missouri and Kansas. There's Carnival miniature painters. There's Raging Heroes miniature painters. There's groups for all these different figure painters. And you can post works in progress, you can get feedback, you can just show off what you're doing, and it's an amazing thing to see how kind and supportive the communities are. Like, even if somebody's just starting out and they're not good, the communities don't come right out and tell you that. They're not going to say, dude, that sucks, you need to work on this. They'll give you constructive criticism and help you improve as a painter. And that's something I didn't have as a kid growing up. There wasn't any online tutorials I could watch or people that I could go to and say, can you teach me how to do this? And now almost every game store has classes that you can take to become better miniature painters. And I highly recommend taking the classes if that's something you're interested in. Learning how to be a better miniature painter. Even if you're already an experienced miniature painter, I would still highly recommend taking the classes, because there's always something you can learn from that. There's always going to be something you can learn, or something you can learn how to do better or easier or faster or cheaper. Like I said, if you're stuck for ideas, you don't know what color to paint your wizard's robe, for example, you can go on YouTube and find tutorials that'll teach you how to do even really difficult colors very well. And so it's a resource that I think has made a huge difference for me, and hopefully it'll make a huge difference for you. Hopefully that's why you're watching my videos. I would like to think that I've made a difference and made something a little bit easier for some of you, or given you some ideas and something to work on. But yeah, definitely go check it out. There's a lot of miniature painters out there. There's a lot of how-to videos out there on how to do stuff. So anything you want to learn, there's somebody out there can teach you how to do it. Somebody is probably willing to take the time to sit down and show you how to do something. So take advantage of that resource. that's really all I've got. That's it for the game changers, I think, for miniature painting. There's a lot of game-changing techniques that I've learned, like OSL and non-metallic metal and layering versus just dry brushing and things like that. But that's all going to have to be stuff for another video. These are the game-changing devices, items that I think have helped me improve as a painter over the years. So hopefully, if you're my age, hopefully you've seen something that kind of sparks some nostalgia. Makes you think of the, back in the day when you started. If not, then hopefully you found something useful there, something you can expand on, something else to learn about. So thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks a lot. Bye. Hey Brush Monkeys, Tom from Flying Monkey Studios here. If you like what you see, click like down below. If you want to be notified when new videos come out, click subscribe. And in the meantime, if you want to see how to add one of the miniatures that we've painted on this channel to your own collection, check out our Instagram, Tumblr, and Patreon sites. If you want to support us in doing what we do, check out my Patreon site. Check out my merch store at storefrontier.com/flymonkeystudios. You can get t-shirts, sweatshirts, long sleeve shirts, hoodies, all kinds of stuff there. Go check that out. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye.